Okay, she told me to go first, so I will go first. I'm going to stand up because I want to be able to see everybody. I have a long history with Houston. The first time I exhibited here was in 1977, I believe, in a show called Dale Gas, or like Give It Gas, Step on It. And it was the first so-called Chicano expression here in Texas at the museum level, and I think it was only the second exhibit of its type nationally. There was one that preceded us in California. But anyway, I have a long history with this institution and also with Houston. At one time I had gallery representation here, but this is my fourth time here, so yeah, good to be back. It's quite a gap there between the last time I was here and now, but it's good to be back here. But anyway, let me introduce myself now. Ana will talk about herself, but this is Ana Fernandez. And I'm César Martinez, and I am from Laredo, Texas originally. I have lived in San Antonio since 1971. And never planned on living there, but it turned out that way. It was a good fit. And with the kind of work that I do, obviously, which is contemporary Chicano culture, Mexican American culture, Hispanic culture, whatever you want to call it. San Antonio is more than 50% Latino in general. And so it is a good nurturing environment for me, and that is where I have been doing most of my work. Here in Houston, I have also shown at the the Museum of Fine Arts, and I'm in their collection also. And so anyway, I'm not gonna belabor my history here, so I would like now for Ana to introduce herself.
Thank you, Cesar. My name is Ana Fernandez, and I'm from Corpus Christi, Texas. So first of all, I want to say I'm really excited to be speaking with Cesar because when I was a little girl, my mom's a painter, so she would always take me to Corpus Christi. And one of the artists that I really remember always seeing, I guess I was just attracted to all the shapes and the colors, was your work. And so I told my mom that we were, first of all, that I even knew you. She was excited about that. And then I told her that we were in the show together. And so to be speaking with you is really special because that's one of the earliest. I remember looking through books and going to the museum and seeing all the paintings. And being able to see work at such an early age as a child, and my mom being a painter, it was really made it a possibility for me to one day that's what would be a acceptable direction to go into. Because at first I wanted to be a teacher like my mom, and then I wanted to study history, and I had all these different ideas. But all the while I'd been painting and drawing. It's like having a friend that you always have with you constantly. And then one day you find yourself at like an opening, and so it's such a funny thing because I've always painted and drawn, and it's always been a part of my life, and it's led me to some really, really fun and cool places. And when I was in school, I smelled one of the students open the door of the art building at UTSA, and all this smell of oil paint came out. And I was like, oh man, that's really what I should be going back to. So that's when I made the decision to study art, and ever since then I've been painting. I try to paint every day, just a part of my life. And I lost my train of thought. Oh, and I also have a food truck. So because I try to make my life into such a way that I'm able to paint. I've always had odd jobs. I've always had like this kind of the strange, kind of odd jobs no one wants. And so I started a food truck in 2012, and we called it the Chili Queens. Or it was called the Institute of Chili, but I was paying homage to the Chili Queens of San Antonio. And part of the reason I started my food truck was because I noticed that right around that area, a lot of people in San Antonio were starting up like the quote unquote like gourmet food trucks. And they were proclaiming, well, we're the very first gourmet food trucks. Like, first of all, you're not the very first. And for you to say that it's gourmet is implying that Mexican food is not. So that upset me and fueled my motivation to start the Institute of Chili, basically to remind everybody, like, the Chili Queens in San Antonio were the very first mobile food vendors that there were, and they're still around. And so I started making chili that was based on an old recipe from the Institute of Texan Cultures. And so that got me on various cooking channels and travel channels. And so that was a whole other side that I hadn't expected. So right now I have a good equilibrium between my paintings and my food truck. And now, as I've gone into my new series, I'm focusing on the idea of labor, and just basically it's a semi-autobiographical, I guess you could say, because I work on a food truck. And so the paintings that I have on display here feature 2 women selling roses by the street, and then the other one is a Raspa shop where they sell stuff. So I'm kind of bringing in that aspect of my life into as a subject of my work. But that's kind of an overview of my professional experience so far.
I think it bears, well, I'm going to go into the obvious. There's a big generation gap here. And by way of orientation, in regards to that, Ana's mother went to the same college I did in South Texas way back in the 60s. And so in line with what I'm saying, I'm pretty sure that I am the oldest exhibiting artist in this show. There's another one, Jose Rivera, who was also here in that exhibition that I mentioned, Dalegas, but he's younger than me. So anyway, I am the oldest. What is nice about that is that I assume, it being that I'm here, that my work after all these years still has some kind of viability, and it is indeed an honor to be showing with younger artists, and it's a very, very good thing. As a younger artist, well, can you tell us something about being of another generation? Mine had a lot of struggles, especially in San Antonio, because it was not like it is now. San Antonio, by the way, is probably now very similar to Houston, certainly not as extensive, but it is very across the board, very inclusive, and there's all kinds of alternative spaces, and there's a couple of major museums. So, that's very nice. But for me and my peers, it was a struggle. What about for you?
Well, it reminds me, you said that my mom went to A&I, so she knew some of the artists. I'm forgetting his name now. Amado, yeah, she knew Amado. But my mom was going to go to school, and one of her art teachers at that time told her, please don't get married, please don't have children. And she actually, my mom was told that. And my mom was dating this really rich man from Egypt. They were about to get married, and then they didn't, and then she met my father, who was also at Texas A&I, and he had been kept a year back in school because they said that he hadn't completed all his classes. It was really racist back then, and he's an engineer, and so he had to stay one extra semester because the teacher said, oh, actually you're not graduating, you're one class short. But if that hadn't happened, they wouldn't have met. So my parents got together. It was a completely different time because my mom was actually told, if you have children and if you have a husband, you won't be able to paint. And he encouraged her to go to art school. So my entire life, I always remembered that because my mom is such a talent. Like, she's such a great painter. She paints these big paintings, and she does paint now. So me growing up, I was always encouraged to be an artist. Like, my mom would always say, yeah, you can, like, it would be great if you did it. So I've never felt like I really had to choose. Probably one of the biggest struggles I have noticed, and that I do have as far as painting, is that, especially like in the Latino painting community, it's very male dominated, and some collectors really prefer, like, it's a lot harder to sell women's work, so to speak, and at a certain price. So I am aware of that, but I really don't let it stop me, because I feel like, even the type of painting I do, which is realistic, I do like realism, and so I don't know. I guess I don't fit into people's ideas of what, and then I do bigger work, and in my life, painting always comes first, so I don't really have a problem with having to choose. I don't have any children, but it just makes me sad when I think about my mom's generation and how it was so different back then for you and for my mom, me coming up. But I guess one of the struggles I also faced going to school in California is even the fact that I was painting at all. Just painting in and of itself is something that's kind of looked down upon and seen as old-fashioned. So that was kind of another thing I kind of came up against, like, oh, well, you're painting pictures of stuff that's real. That was something that was also kind of an interesting struggle, but it's by no means, it's changed. But one of the struggles that I see is mostly being a woman in this world, which is kind of controlled by men. But it's been okay for me, but I definitely feel that.
Maybe I should, well, I will say a thing or two about where I went to college and her mother also, which was, at that time, it was Texas A&I University in Kingsville, Texas. It is now part of the A&M system. But nothing happens in a vacuum. It's no coincidence that in that show that I mentioned earlier, Dalegas, that was here in 1977, that I can think of, there were 4 artists, including myself, who came out of Texas A&I University. So what is how come? Well, that is, I would say that Texas A&I University was one of the major hubs for Chicano political activities, and I made their acquaintance when I was there. That included Jose Ángel Gutierrez and Carlos Guerra, and there were others. But that is what started my own mind in thinking in cultural terms. And eventually that would become basically the substance of what I do. There was a time when I was in college, and then for many years after, I would read all of the art magazines, and a notion entered my head that the only way that you can be a real artist is you got to go to New York. And the art that I was interested in was basically abstract thing, color field painting. Jules Salitsky, Mark Roscoe in his own way was that, Kenneth Noland. And that is the type of work that I was trying to do, but because of this political process that entered my mind, I started realizing that what I was doing was not really addressing all these new ideas that were coming into my head. And anyway, the rest is, of course, what you can see what's here. But there is still, in the surrounding areas of my work, you still see some of that color field painting.
Oh, yeah, I can definitely see Mark Rothko's influence.
Yeah.
So I'm originally from Corpus, which is really close to Kingsville. And the other day I went back to Corpus, and I'm driving around, I'm looking at everything, and I'm going, this is such a depressing little neighborhood where my dad had his office. I'm looking around, and I'm like, it's right down the street from where Selena had her recording studio, and just kind of that whole neighborhood where Selena, the singer, was from. And I was like, wow, nobody really knows about Corpus, and a lot of tourists are coming to Corpus because of the Selena angle. And I realized that some of these businesses that have been here, that's where my grandfather had his carpentry business. There's so many small little businesses everywhere, and they're not really documented, so I started taking pictures because I found a picture of my grandfather's carpentry business, and I come from a long line of businessmen, so my grandfather had a carpentry business, and then my father is an engineer, so he had his own consulting business. So that piece of property there, it was kind of a rundown block, but I started to document just the whole neighborhoods in the street and just try to kind of get it, because I realized like no one is really taking pictures of these. And then like the convenience store across the street from where I grew up, like that convenience store might only really mean something to like 30 people in the neighborhood. It doesn't really mean anything to anybody else, but it may mean something to those 30 people that are from that area. So lately I've been going back to Corpus and just documenting with my camera. And I use some of those pictures as a basis for my painting, because when I lived in LA, I was doing landscapes and streetscapes, but they just felt so unoriginal because of the fact that it's Los Angeles and everybody documents it. It's a backdrop to so many things. Whereas I feel like, these neighborhoods in Corpus or in San Antonio are so really underrepresented and underdocumented. So for me, as an aside to the painting, I also have a huge big catalog of just photographs of just the neighborhood. And that's another part of what I do is the photography, and just kind of a historical documentation of the neighborhoods that I feel is something that a lot of people have said is really valuable to that. And also, which is kind of funny, because the city of San Antonio hired me to do a bunch of paintings of buildings that they had torn down to build the hemisphere. So when I was doing some research, I thought it was kind of funny that they didn't have any pictures of anything else, only the stuff that they had knocked down. But really, they had no other historical pictures of these neighborhoods where black people and Mexican people lived. You know, they just don't exist unless the city paid to knock them down. So I feel like with what I'm doing now, which is documenting these places, I don't feel like there's a lot of that. So I forgot what my original point was, but basically that's that's what I've been doing in addition to my painting. Sorry, I talk in big like circles, so. But you know how Corpus is.
Yeah. There was something that I wanted to ask you about your work because I met Ana through a collector who's sitting right there, Joe Diaz, and he's also a lender to this exhibit. But anyway, he took me to her studio. You got to see this, you know, and so I liked what Ana was doing, and I of course was relating to her work in terms of my own. It's inevitable, and it was very, very direct, very upfront. Now, I could be mistaken, but at that time, I don't remember seeing any people in your work, but I'm seeing a lot of, I noticed that it's very new work. There are some people in there. Is that a new thing, or was I just missing it at that time?
Well, at first I was only painting landscapes because I kind of thought of the houses as portraits. Yeah. So when I would paint somebody, that's kind of how that's when I met Joe, when I was doing mostly house paintings, and I would take pictures of neighborhood houses and I would paint the houses, and I didn't want people to interfere because I felt like the house itself was a portrait. And so anytime you put a person in, it would be the protagonist, you know, that would be the character. So I try to take that out, and I would make like a car would be a stand-in as a portrait of a person, or like some Christmas lights or some kind of decorations would be the stand-in. But now I have been painting more people and trying to kind of explore like relationships between people in these spaces. But yeah, I didn't really paint a lot of people.
Well, that's interesting because what you just said, I also did not want any distractions in my own work in the Pachuco series here, which are, it's fair enough to call them portraits. They're not really portraits. They are based on real people, but they're more like physiological types. I think all of us look like somebody, and that's because we belong in some category there, having to do with our ancestry and so on and so forth. And what I have been mining all of this time has been a universality within Chicano, Mexican American culture, and a comment that I get oftentimes, and I think it's kind of music to my ears, is that people will say, well, I know that guy, and I've seen him, and on and on. And that's because it's very well calculated on my part. So when I hear that, I said, bingo, you know, I got it. But anyway, going back to what I was saying, and what you said, you know, I did not want anything interfering with just the person that is there, the character that is there. And so originally, on a more technical aspect of this, is that my original idea was that I just wanted a flat color field acting as a background. It's not really a background, it's the color around the figure. That's how I think of it. And if you look closely, you know that it doesn't go beyond that, behind the thing. It stops at the edge and then it does stuff. That's how I paint them. I think I lost my train of thought. You want to say something? I think I said enough anyway. I already covered it.
Do you want to take questions at this point?
No. I forgot what it was.
I will say one thing I really like about the color background. I like how it makes it, because I love abstraction.
Oh, okay. I remember.
Is that what you were going to say?
My original idea was that I wanted a very flat field of color around the figure. And what I got was exactly that. It didn't work. It was dead space. So it took some figuring to work out a system for painting that area around the figures. And if you look closely, not so much in that one, and it's not a 100% thing either. It varies from what I'm trying to do. But especially in this one here and in that one there, you see a lot of the paint that is under there. There's several layers, and I always let you see it, but that is what gives the that area a little bit of life. Like I said, I did not want dead space there, and so that is how I resolved that. Your work has atmosphere, so
I was going to say,
nothing to worry about there.
Well, I like the abstraction.
Yeah.
Even in my paintings, I'm very much about the composition. So when you see them from a distance, like when I was coming in and I saw the one that's on the poster, it breaks into an abstract composition. So I feel like my paintings have a lot of different avenues for people to come into. People that like representation, it's easy to access. And then painters, I'm a painter's painter, so they realize what I'm doing with the color, and they can see what I'm doing with the composition. But I feel like yours has that element of abstraction that I've always been drawn to, with the way you handle the form, the human form, and with the background. So I feel like we have that in common, plus your use of color. I think it probably soaked into me, because that's what I really liked when I was younger, when I would look at your work, is that bright, those saturated colors.
I have a feeling that all of us whose work is mostly figurative or objects and all of that, there is a degree of illustration there, but we want to be painters a lot of the time, and it's about the paint too, and the qualities of paint. And I think that is what drew me originally to color field painting, because it was about the paint itself. And I thought that there was a lot of drama going on there in certain artists' work. Like, for example, Jules Olitsky's work was mostly what seemed monochrome, but it really wasn't. It was more like my stuff, living, the way the paint is applied is living. And then there's touches of colors on the edges. To me, that was like very dramatic, and I like dramatic stuff. I can tell you that, well, it's ironic actually, because there was a painting that was attributed, in all of the art books, it was attributed to Rembrandt. It's called Man with a Golden Helmet. And it had very theatrical lighting, and the helmet was gold and blah, blah, blah. And I always liked that painting, but it turns out that it was not really by, according to what they say, what experts say, it was not really by Rembrandt. It was by artists from his school, maybe his assistants, because that is the way that it worked back then.
One time I had this, you just reminded me, because somebody said, oh, has anybody ever, seen you taking a picture of their house and like asked you what you were doing? But it never happens, because I do them really fast, and I always just tell them I'm an artist, and I always show on my phone or whatever. I'm like, oh, now I've gotten more to where I can talk to people, but before I would just take pictures. So one time at this opening, this young guy walks in with all his friends. He must have been like 20, and he was at First Friday, so it was kind of like a more general crowd. And he comes in, and he looks at one of my paintings. He just stopped dead in his tracks, and then he kind of looks around kind of like that, like maybe he thought he was being punked. And then I walk up to him, because I was like, I'll bet you that's his house. I just had this feeling. And he goes, did you paint this? And I said, yeah. And he goes, oh my God. He's like, that's my house. That's my Suburban. He's like, this is crazy. Is the one with the Suburban. And he's like, that's my house. I can't believe this. Like, what street was that? And I was like, oh, it was, and he's like, yeah, that's my street. And then he brought his mom in, and I was there when he brought his mom in, like the next day. And he goes, look, Mom. He's like, it's art. And I always love that, because he saw things in a different way. Like, oh, look, it's like somebody thought this was art. And then he told me the story behind it, which was that his mother had cancer, and so she wasn't able to put up their Christmas decorations that year. So that was the year that they got their neighbors to help out. And when I was thinking about all that, I was like, oh, I feel like I need to have more intimacy in my work, because a lot of times I'm separated from it, and I don't, just in my work and my photography, I'm not as like connected with the things that I'm kind of treating it as just, an object, a bottle, a table. It's, very objective. And then so that's what kind of got me into doing more portraiture and like talking to the people behind it. But yeah, it was a funny moment, because I can't imagine what that must feel like, walking into a gallery, some random gallery, and seeing a picture of your car and your house. Something
that that I would like to address also is that because there's two works that of mine here in this show that are kind of anomalous. What holds them together is the trapezoidal shape of what I call my, well, it's not really ace, the steles is what I call them. And steles, of course, usually a monolithic piece of rock with inscriptions on it, ancient. And I liked working with that idea. And I wanted to do collages for a long time, and for a long time I was saving beer bottle labels because of the metallic paint in them. It's like I like metallic color, and especially the quality of Dos Equis labels, Tecate labels, Carta Blanca labels. So I was peeling them off and saving them, and eventually I did collages with them. But what started me on the stele idea is that I did one particular piece that had as its subject Cabeza de Vaca, the Spaniard who was lost in Texas for many years until he finally found his way back, and in the process he learned a lot about the native populations, and not all of his experiences with Native Americans of the area were good, but he ended up having a very empathizing with them and put in a good word for them in Spain, because the Spaniards were known to be very cruel to the native peoples. But he was one lone voice that was advocating for humane treatment of all human beings. So anyway, I did a piece having to do with that, and I tapped into my own interest in archaeology, and also, but more local or more Texas. It has to do with pictographs and cave paintings, and also paintings that have been inscribed on rocks. And so in that particular piece that I did of having to do with Cabeza de Vacas, I tapped into that kind of design, and everything in it is based on that, but it also tells a story about his journey, which is basically a human at the mercy of the natural elements. So anyway, that is the background to that particular trapezoidal shape. This other piece is a thing in itself. I just wanted something to do something that that was a presence, moody maybe, who knows, something that sits on a wall very quietly, like a Mark Roscoe painting. I don't presume to be another Mark Roscoe, but that was something that influenced me. Not so much the work itself of Mark Roscoe, the effect that it has. But that's. That one, by the way, has no meaning. That particular piece with the Tecate labels, it's just a. I happen to have a lot of them, and so I was riffing on all of the different elements, the mountains that are in the label, and that's all it is. A monument, I guess, to Tecate, and I drink beer. So. But anyway, that is the explanation of that.
How did you get started in the Serape series? It looks so beautiful and so powerful. The Serape painting. How did you get started in doing those?
The color progressions that you can barely see in this particular piece is calculated to be that way. But a long time ago, I did a series called the Mexican Serape series, or the Serape series. And the most popular types of serapes are the ones that you see in Mexican marketplaces, with color progressions that go from light to dark, or bright to dim, or whatever. And I did many paintings that had to do with that. It was just a configuration on paper or canvas, and then with color progressions. Eventually, when I got the idea for this particular piece here, I wanted something else entirely, but it occurred to me that maybe the color progressions that you see in a serape could serve me well, but I decided that I didn't want something colorful or very pretty. Maybe I should say something about pretty. When I started painting the Pachuco series, older people from my culture, but older generations, would tell me that, they like the work and it rings true, and everything, but they kind of were uncomfortable with it, like it was not proper subject matter, and sometimes they would actually say, "Why don't you paint something pretty?" So that is what led to the Serape series, because serapes are very pretty. But anyway, this is something else entirely. I react to everything, and sometimes I say to myself, "I'll never do this, I'll never do that." But it seems that as soon as I say something very definite, it's like, "Oh, but wait a minute," and I come up with an idea, and then I end up doing it. In the course of my professional life, like for example, at one time I thought everybody was doing Vírgenes de Guadalupe and pyramids and El Mestizo, that configuration, but the physiological types, and I'll never do this, and I'll never do it. I ended up doing all of them because I got ideas that I thought were ironic and also a different way of dealing with those very well-known symbols. Have you ever had to do anything like that in your own work, where maybe somebody's telling you, you do this too much, or you haven't done this, or has it always been like just pretty much what you determined? In my case, I've reacted.
Well, not exactly that, but I've had some people, they'll say, "Well, why do you focus on this particular neighborhood?" I'm like, it just happens to be where I live. Like, all these paintings that you see, these are places that I just drive by. And it reminds me of one time when I was in California, or somebody was like, "Oh, you eat like Mexican food every day." And I'm like, I don't, it's just food. Like, in other words, it's a corn tortilla with an egg, and I roll it up in something that looks to you like a taco. But to me, it's just a way to eat. So it's not my label, it's yours. Like, or how does it feel to be a woman? Or how does it feel to be, I'm like, I'm just myself. You're the one that's attributing all of those things on me and making me the other, because I assume you think that you're standard. The white man is like, oh, you're this and you're that. So I've had a little bit of that where people go, "Oh, why are you hitting these neighborhoods?" But I'm like, well, that's really where I live. That's where I come from. Like, and then like the painting called Rosas that's back on that wall, that's a flower stand. It's a temporary pop-up that was on the street on Culebra Road where I'm going to my mom's house. And so I stopped to get my mom some flowers for Mother's Day, and I liked the way their sign looked. So I said, "Do you mind if I take some pictures?" And she's like, "Sure." So when I'm painting the painting, I had bought one of those flowers, so it had just happened in the photo to be the one that was right in front of her face. And so when I'm painting it, I thought, well, should I put her face in or should I not? And I thought, no, I'm going to leave the flowers to cover her face because they're invisible, like street vendors, and me, myself being one. Like, I'll go one day being like this, dressed to go to an opening, and people are saying hello, literally to the next day wearing an apron and my hair is up, working on my food truck. And the way that I'm treated is so different. I'm just literally invisible, even by people that I know, that they don't recognize me because they're just like, pff. And so I know what it feels like to be on the other end, where you're like at an event or even working at someone's house and they're like, I'm the servant. Oh, cool. I'm the servant, and they're like, it's like you become completely invisible. So I feel like I'm working from both sides. And another example, just kind of tie into that painting, I had somebody say something like, "Well, you shouldn't sell that lady a painting because she was really kind of rude." And I'm like, my mom used to pick cotton. Like, you think I'm the kind of person that's going to turn down a sale? Like, my mom used to pick cotton for 5 cents a day. Like, to think that I can make money from sitting at my desk in air conditioner and selling something, that's my attitude in life. I'm a worker. And so now I'm focusing in my work, kind of trying to capture that.